Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm so pleased to be here with you all tonight. I am broadcasting our members event from inside the African American Heritage Center. We're in the green room. Some of you might be familiar with this space. We opened the Heritage Center this October with an exhibition of work by photographer Lola Flash. The exhibition is entitled Salt. It is our last exhibition for the year in celebration of the 19th Amendment and the role African American women have played in advancing American democracy. If you haven't seen it yet, I really want to welcome you to come on down. We've got it so that it's safe for you to be here. You just need to pick up a ticket, reserve a time to come in. It's a really wonderful show. And we have continued our programming all year long with an Evelyn Barber lecture series. So after you've finished engaging with us tonight, you might want to take a look at some of the other videos that are on the channel that are from the lecture series. And as I have said before, it is because of our membership, because of people like you who care about history, who care about culture, who care about this community, that we are able to do the kind of work that we do and be as imaginative as we want to be. And so this event was something that even though we are within the throes of the pandemic, and even though I personally have no idea how to do these events, I have to rely on my colleague Leslie Scott Jones to help me out, we still wanted to engage with our members. Some of you were with us last year when we were at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts for the Howardina Pindell exhibition. And we have just as an exciting experience tonight as I thought that experience was. Tonight's conversation is considering the presidential plantation in the 21st century. And we have two people with us who are experts on the topic, who I will introduce to you tonight. And I'm really pleased that we were able to bring them together for the conversation. So let me first introduce Elizabeth Chu, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Curator at James Madison's Montpelier, where she oversees the curatorial education, historic preservation, archaeology, and research departments. She's an art historian who holds a BA from Yale and an MA from the Courtauld Institute of the University of London and a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has worked at museums and historic sites since 1985, including 10 years in art museums in Washington, D.C. At Montpelier, she has overseen furnishings of the Madison's house, the excavation and reconstruction of 6 slave dwellings and work buildings, and the creation of the exhibition, The Mayer Distinction of Color, winner of 6 national awards. As curator at Monticello for 13 years, she was instrumental in expanding interpretation to include women, domestic work, and slavery. She curated the exhibition To Try All Things, Monticello as Experiment, in the David M. Rubenstein Visitor Center, and was co-curator with Rex Ellis of the exhibition Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello Paradox of Liberty. She has taught art history at the University of North Carolina, University of Virginia, James Madison University, Wake Forest University, and Davidson College, and has published and lectured widely on ways that race and gender intersect with art collecting, architectural patronage, domestic life, and material culture in early American Republic. And I am pleased to call her friend. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Andrea.
We also have with us tonight James French, who was elected as the founding chair of the Montpelier Descendants Committee in 2019 at a Juneteenth gathering of descendants who assembled to establish an independent organization founded on the principles of the rubric. Soon thereafter, he was invited to serve on the board of the Montpelier Foundation, where he serves on the executive committee and various other committees. James's dual role as the founding chair of the MDC and member of the board of directors marks a significant milestone in the Descendants movement. His is the first instance of a member of Descendants community joining the executive committee of a major presidential home site appointed to represent their interests. James has James brings governance, financial, and entrepreneurial experience to these roles. After graduating from the Darden Graduate School of Business Administration at UVA, James worked for the Citigroup in West and Central Africa. He worked in North Africa for the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Technical Assistance and sat on corporate boards for the International Finance Corporation in South Africa. James is currently at work as an entrepreneur expanding financial services to underserved communities across Africa and other emerging economies using cutting-edge financial technology. James's late mother, Carolyn French, was a local and national activist, a public historian, and a co-founder of the Orange County African American Historical Society, which is a very active historical society, which has done so much work over the last few years, certainly to bring Juneteenth to Montpelier. And so I am really excited to welcome you both for this conversation. When I say that we have experts at the table, we definitely do that. So Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you because of your work both at Monticello and Montpelier. You have shepherded these institutions into the 21st century in some significant ways, I would say. I mean, I remember, first of all, my very first exhibition when I was a curator at the University Art Museum, for instance, was an exhibition by Carrie Mae Weems. And she had done one panel that vaguely referenced Jefferson and Hemings. And we got phone calls that said, if that connection were made, you know, they'd shut it down. So you were there for some of that. So tell us a little bit about your time interpreting history at Monticello and Montpelier. What are your major milestones, do you think, that have occurred in the last few years, 10 years?
So I started my position at Monticello in January of the year 2000, literally the week after they had finally announced that, yes, we believe that Jefferson and Sally Hemings had a long relationship and 6 children. But it literally took many years after that for the interpretation to kind of catch up. But it was an incredibly interesting time to be at Monticello and really in the field at large, as you know, Andrea. I mean, it was a massive time of change.
Yeah.
So
what do you think are your milestones, though? If you were going to mark even the last 20 years, because that's where we are, right? What are the things that you would say, you know, that moment is one, but what are some of the other high points?
A very, very quiet moment that really no one knows about happened in 1999 when out in Orange County at Montpelier, Rebecca Gilmore Coleman, who was a descendant of the people enslaved at Montpelier, approached Montpelier about having a commemoration of the slave cemetery, which involved the local descendant community at Montpelier for the first time. And then from that, she and Carolyn French founded the Orange County African American Historical Society, which has been an incredibly important partner with Montpelier ever since then. And that's been like almost 22 years now.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of the work that you've been doing at Montpelier, how do you characterize that? What, you know, we've talked about in your bio, we talked about, you know, working in the home, but how do you characterize that work? What is it that you've been working on and been able to accomplish?
So all of this, all the work at Montpelier, I have to say, was funded by a gift of $10 million from the self-described patriotic philanthropist, David Rubenstein. But he had absolutely no strings attached to any of the funding. And so we decided, well, first of all, we did very careful archaeological research and then reconstructions of slave dwellings and workspaces. We're building the final one currently. But then we decided to do an exhibition rather than furnish the cellar level of the house. And I think that was a really important decision because we were able to do something that we wouldn't have been able to do if we had furnished working spaces and kitchens, for example. But what the most important aspect of that, as had many things been prior to that at Monticello, was that members of the descendant community were partners and collaborators on the exhibition, and their voices and faces were part of what visitors experienced when they went to the exhibition. And then from that project came the decision within the descendant community to organize and to create the Montpelier Descendant Committee as the representatives of the community, which elected James as its chair, which has created a level of sort of coexistence between an historic site and a descendant community that has been, I think, unlike any other in the country that I know of.
Mm-hmm. James, I'm going to bring you in on that because that opens a question. So, how would you, in your estimation and your experience to this point, how would you describe that relationship between descendants and museums? How has that relationship been for you and your other colleagues working on projects with Montpelier?
Well, I would say, Andrea, that it's an evolving relationship. As Elizabeth just said, the relationship with descendants really goes way back, in the case of Montpelier, 20 years in a formal sense, and obviously much further to the establishment of Montpelier historically. But the relationship was very unbalanced. And even though descendants did approach Montpelier, they organized Orange County Historical Society, which was founded and approached Montpelier, and a lot of, the David Rubenstein gift and the Mere Distinction of Color program was launched, which themselves were all first and very important steps forward. There was still a very significant imbalance of decision making and authority in terms of representation at the management level of these sites, and I think Montpelier is an example of that. And so, really, over the last year, we formed about a year ago the Montpelier Descendants Committee. We've been focusing on two things. One is to expand the organization to be inclusive of descendants, and there are a lot of descendants of Montpelier, and I'll get to in a second. I'll get to what we mean when we say descendants. I think that's an important thing to talk about. But in parallel to that is a very important kind of a new path forward, which is to share in all of the governance decisions of a site such as this. And we feel that we have a special responsibility to our ancestors and to future generations and to all Americans to be included, centrally included in these decision-making processes at the highest levels. And the reason for that is that representation decisions are being made, decisions about what history is being told, who it includes, who it excludes, what research questions are being posed, what the public engagement will be like, and frankly, what does the public want to hear from these sites that it has never, that has not historically heard. So what are the new messages that will resonate for newer generations? And the descendants feel that that in a sense they represent these untold stories, and we know that we can't depend on others to tell these stories for us. That there are stories, and we must be involved in their discovery and their and they're telling. So it's an evolving relationship. It hasn't always been easy, I have to say, because we're talking about sharing of decision making, sharing of power, in essence, and those conversations can be fraught, but they're necessary, and we believe that they will have an impact far beyond Montpelier itself.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. Elizabeth, I want to just kind of hone in a little bit because, you know, the Mere Distinction of Color, an award-winning exhibition, right? And as James has described, this kind of relationship really does open up the field of museumship quite broadly now. I mean, it's pushing a relationship that had not been considered before. So let me ask a little bit about the process of creating that exhibition. How did you actually work with Descendants? What was the sort of, can you walk us through that process?
Sure. And this is an example of how the project-based relationships worked prior to the creation of the Montpelier Descendants Committee in 2019. And I mean, it's basically my colleagues in the education department and archaeology departments and curatorial departments and research also, I guess. We thought about who we thought would be interested and, collaborators on the project, and we invited them to a planning meeting, which was in like October of 2015. And that's how, but it wasn't like we were reaching out and inviting people. That wasn't generated by the community. I mean, it was a very unbalanced relationship, as James was saying. It was absolutely all on Montpelier's side of saying, of deciding who it would be and say, would you like to take part in this?
Did the process, once you brought the Descendants in, from where you began with your sort of, call it storyboard, right, about what the exhibition would look like, how did having these new voices in that process change your storyboard? Were you open, or how, I'm just really trying to understand what that looked like.
So here's some examples. So, this is before I got to Montpelier, but it was they had decided that this is a Montpelier decision. They decided to place the exhibition in the cellar level of the house, which would have been spaces where enslaved people worked and sometimes lived. And when we had the sort of organizing meeting in October of 2015, some of the Descendant group members were very upset about it. Others said, we absolutely cannot forget at any point along the way that these were spaces where our enslaved ancestors were held to work in bondage. And so we thought about various ways of keeping visitors knowing that the whole time they were in the exhibition, but also ways of not having it become a space that was just about information, that never forgetting that enslaved people were laboring in those spaces.
So, James, so this relationship, and I correct me if I'm wrong, were you engaged in those conversations about the Mere Distinction of Color as well, you personally?
No, this was prior to the formation of the MDC. Right. So that work had gone on, and tremendous work. I would agree that it's very, the work of Elizabeth and others, the experts on the staff at Montpelier did a great job. So what the Descendants did is, we had to organize.
Mhm.
We felt that it was very important that we not wait until we be asked for our input into exhibits such as this, and that it's really scratching the surface. We have to keep in mind what a place, and I don't want to just talk about Montpelier because I think
No.
Montpelier is representative. So what a place like Montpelier is. Montpelier is, first of all, a plantation. It existed for pure monetary purposes, and the way that it created wealth was through slavery, regardless of who the inhabitants were. And so that's really the root of the story of Montpelier. It just so happens that this particular plantation had a very famous resident who did some incredible historic things in this particular region. It happened in Orange County. It did not happen 50 miles to the west or 50 miles to the east. And it happened in an area where other iconic American figures of American history also hailed from. So there's a particular ecosystem that was created of thoughts of freedom and thoughts of enslavement that coincided and coexisted. And so we feel that the story traditionally that has been told has really been the story of kind of the documents that were produced in these plantations, divorced from the people. The Madisons were outnumbered 24-1 by the people they enslaved. And surely everything that emanated from that plantation, whether it's an agricultural product, an economic product, or an intellectual product, those 24 people had something to do with it. And so we feel that the mere distinction of color, while it was a great initiative, it was only a start to tell the story of the contributions of those who had traditionally been silenced, and we're trying to move the conversation towards that part of the story. We have a term at Montpelier, we call it whole truth, and so the whole truth hasn't been told yet, and so that aspect of the story should be, in our view, informed by descendants who have an ethical obligation as to how that story is told.
Right. James, how many members are there of the descendant group? You started to touch on that, but how many of you are there?
So we have a community, which is a large, over 300 people, and we have a committee. And the committee is about a little under 30 people right now, and growing. But we represent a large community. We are organized along the principles of, you mentioned it when you read my bio, the rubric that you referred to, the rubric of best practices, which is a huge milestone in intellectual thought in terms of how descendants engage places of former slavery. And the rubric basically is, if you boiled it down, it was written by Elizabeth was one of the scholars, but some of the best the thought leaders in historic preservation and the study of slavery convened at Montpelier, and if you to write the rubric in 2019. And if you boiled it down to a few kind of nuggets, one of the essential features of it is that there must be equal sharing of authority and decision making between descendants and those who are the stewards of the presidential site, so the management, the board, et cetera, of Montpelier. And the other is getting back to this notion of who is a descendant. Now, as we agree with the rubric's definition of a descendant is those people who are, first of all, can trace their descendants genealogically to a particular location. But we have to expand that, because families that live there and built these places over generations were not constrained by property boundaries. So families interacted just like families everywhere, free or enslaved. And so since the written history of these families was never written in most cases for the enslaved. We expand the definition of descendants to be not just within a property boundary, which is the slave owner's property boundary. We don't want that to be the definition of family, but to be expanded to include the adjoining communities, and that can go from, you know, a community, say in the case of Orange, from Montpelier all the way down to Monticello, along the Southwest Mountains and beyond into Central Virginia, because this was an ecosystem of families and economic relationships, and people moved back and forth, both enslaved and free.
Yeah, that's one of the things too, because the work that I've been doing here at the Heritage Center, we've been doing, we began with an exhibition that was about the Jefferson School post 1865. And in a few years ago, well, not a few years ago that we created this understanding, but we installed our exhibition, a small part of our exhibition about enslavement in Albemarle County, to really be able to give a broader picture. And as we begin to start to think about how do you move from enslavement into urban society, into a modern society, we couldn't leave out that part of the conversation, because so much of the movement of people, not only in the moment of enslavement, but also in the moment, you know, of, you know, the 1890s that we describe as this migration, that we weren't just talking about Charlottesville's families. We were talking about, as you say, James, a much larger ecosystem that
Right.
was also economically based. You know, how do you explain a 30-year building of a Black middle class in these areas without really considering what that really looked like? So I fully understand what you're talking about and how you describe it. But I'm intrigued by the way in which this process is so groundbreaking, you know, and that the way in which, as we think about how not just plantations, but institutions, I mean, you know, generally speaking, who are telling stories about people, how do they begin to engage those very people in those narratives, you know? And if you're thinking broadly, what does that look like? What does it mean to engage people in that process? Is it simply, okay, we're going to go out and do oral histories? I understand the piece about governance, institutional governance, but I'm also interested in how are we going to engage that ecosystem that you're talking about? What does that look like, really?
That's a really excellent question. So this is something that we think quite a bit about. And yes, governance is one thing. What are you going to govern? What are the questions you're going to ask? And so I mentioned the rubric. The rubric is a set of principles. It's an evaluation framework. It's really cutting edge. And for those who aren't familiar to it, I really encourage people to look at it. But in addition to that, there's a descendant. He's a descendant of the Montpelier region. His name is Dr. Michael Blakey. And Dr. Blakey, I'm sure you know him, Andrea.
Yeah.
He's a bioarchaeologist based at William and Mary, and he was responsible for the African burial project in New York that very famously started very small, and now today actually has more visitors in New York City than Ellis Island. And it's as a result of his refusing to be silenced in not only excavating the bodies of the enslaved who were uncovered during the digging up of this downtown Manhattan area, but also answering questions about who they were and who their descendants are. And so he had to come up with a framework. How do we do this? And he came up with a framework which he coined as the clientage model. Dr. Blakey also coined the term descendant community. So he's a kind of an iconic figure in this field. But the clientage model essentially envisions three different parties as you as you wrestle with these questions. One party is the business partner. So the business partner is the contractual party that has funded work, and that could be an institution, it could be a Montpelier, it could be a David Rubenstein, it could be whatever the institution is. And then the other party would be kind of the profession. And the profession would be scholars, would be could be people such as yourself or Dr. Chu or Dr. Blakey. And those relationships between the contractual party and the scholars seek to uncover certain research questions. And so they have to have something that they're intending to find out, and they've engaged in a program to do that with a certain budget. But there's a third client involved, and it's the ethical client in the clientage model. And the ethical client is the client essentially that has something at stake. It is the client that can be damaged if the questions are not properly answered. It is the client that can be harmed. And in a restorative justice framework, it is the client that has been harmed in the past. So the descendants of the enslaved represent the ethical client. And when there's a disagreement between the contractual party and the professional parties on how certain work is being done, in the clientage model, the ethical client would step in and resolve those differences. The ethical client, in a way, would be the source of the research questions that are being answered, and the arbiter of kind of the interaction between the business client and the professional clients. And it's a very revolutionary way of looking at research and discovery and where questions come from in the first place. And that's a really important thing, where the task, where the scope of work comes from. And so what we intend to do is to continue building relationships between descendant groups, convening, putting on events, inviting thought leaders, and trying to find what the essential questions are that can be asked from a scientific basis, and to provide a co-stewardship role in the research process to answer those questions. So as work is funded, we intend to be intricately and deeply involved in the very questions themselves that are being answered by that research. So I hope that kind of answers a little bit.
Yeah, it does. And it also sort of poses the sort of position for the descendant community, as you're describing this, as drivers in some ways as well, right? Because if you're creating that space where the two parties can convene, then you're also being the group that drives some of that process.
Right.
Right. So that's interesting.
And it's a very important role, and that's what's new about this descendant relationship. So not only were descendants kind of left out of this, frankly, there are people in our group who were not allowed on the property when they were kids, and despite the fact that their ancestors are buried out in the fields. But so there's a question of access, but then there's a question also of access, governance, but also, okay, it is our history, and we must be involved in the formulation of the questions themselves, the process. It is the process. We should be driving that process. Mm-hmm. And so that involves questions of authority and power, and these are never easy questions to resolve, but that's the restorative justice equation. And we feel that Dr. Blakey's model, the clientage model, gives us a framework in which to resolve those tension points, if you will.
Right. So, Elizabeth, I want to sort of talk about a little bit. We're talking about the rubric, And that's that was last summer, if I remember correctly. It was a summer project.
It was
Describe that.
It was in 2018.
2018, okay.
In 2018, we gathered a group of, it was museum professionals, academics from many universities, including Dr. Blakey, and then it was members of descendant communities from many sites across the US, obviously including Mount Vernon, Montpelier, Monticello, and Highland. And we had sort of a weekend workshop. And from that, a smaller group drafted this document that has this long formal title, The Rubric of Best Practices for Descendant Engagement in the Interpretation of Slavery at Museums and Historic Sites. And I can put a link to it in the chat before
Yes.
we finish here. And so that document allows organizations to kind of rate themselves as far as how they're doing in in some different topics. But the ultimate goal, as James was saying, is really parity of governance, parity of decision making, just parity in all senses of the word. And there have actually been some sessions at various museum conferences in the last 2 years where people from different sites have gotten together and talked about how their organizations are doing.
Right.
So
and
I think it has had an impact in the field.
Oh, because that's the question I was really sort of asking.
Mm-hmm.
How many places other than our sort of central Virginia area have been looking at the rubric and trying to adopt that?
So one place that I know of is the not even yet opened Museum of Slavery that's being created in Charleston.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a number of other, there's a site, and I'm really sorry if I'm gonna do a really bad job on names, but there's a site on Hilton Head Island. It's a Freedman's site, and I will think of the name of it, but they're using it. I'm sorry to have my brain be so empty right now, but there are a number of sites that have been using it as a model and working their way with it.
Mm-hmm. And James, from your perspective, then, what is the use of this rubric look like as a point of success? If we begin to start to see a number of institutions across the country that begin to use this rubric, how do you see it then? How do you see the field and then the discourse around enslavement in African American history? How do you see that growing or broadening? I mean, we've got institutions like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, or the museum in Richmond. There seems to have been over the course of even the time that we've been trying to create the Heritage Center, a number of institutions directed at describing African American or African American life and conditions. People like us have a particular point of view, but we're talking about people who don't hold that point of view. We're talking about almost another group of people. So what does the success of the rubric look like in your mind?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, first, let me just say, back to a question that you asked Elizabeth. You asked her what other groups are using the rubric. And the rubric is really emerged as, over this last year, we're in touch with lots of descendant organizations. And over this past year, it's emerging as a gold standard, which is what it should do. And one example very close to you in Charlottesville is the descendants of enslaved communities at UVA. They are using the rubric as they are forming, and it's a newly formed or 501c3 organization that is that's entering into co-stewardship conversations with the University of Virginia. And so, to your question, what does it look like? The rubric is an evaluative tool. And what it does is it allows, essentially, it allows people who have been excluded to knock on the door and say, I have a legitimate voice and I should not be excluded. And what it does is it offers a framework for that conversation of how they can be included and how each party to this conversation can identify a benefit to that inclusion. So what it says is, if it's a very interesting document. It kind of does a brief summary of the history of exclusion of descendants from these organizations, essentially the history of tokenization, if you will, and how that has been the model to tokenize Black people in these organizations. You know, when institutions need to raise money, they kind of trot out some descendants and say, look, you know, here we are, we're being very, you know, we're good, wise people, and we are trying to do the right thing. And when the money comes in, then the person is kind of back to the margins. That's been the history. That's been the best practice. Let's put it that way. And I'm trying to be very diplomatic here. The worst practice goes way downhill very fast. What the rubric does is it kind of gives that relationship a yardstick so that both sides can look at an objective measure and really size up their performance over a period of time. It's a healthy conversation. It's a conversation about the past, about injustice. It helps to take emotion out of it. It helps to focus on healthy outcomes, mutual benefits. It's a dispute resolution tool that will lead, in my view, you asked what does it look like, will lead to much healthier institutions, because the institutions will gain something they don't have today, and that is legitimacy. It is very difficult to argue that, and most of these, you know, these organizations are run by almost entirely white boards, staffed by almost entirely white staff, and have been telling a whitewashed history of places of slavery in a very delicate way. It can only be to the benefit of everyone involved when that is rebalanced, when that equation is rebalanced. And so it will be, first of all, to the benefit of the audience, because the audience is aging. People don't really want to come and see, where the Madisons or the Jeffersons slept at night, as much as they want to see how it applies to their lives. And so we live in a divided country today. We just had a very divisive political season. We're still in it. And places like Montpelier and Monticello and UVA and I can name others, all the way down to Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, and the Georgetown experience and the Berkeley Plantation. They have something to say about how we got here. They have something to say about how we failed in our promise, and how the system, how that failure is systemic. And the rebalancing of the boards, the rebalancing of the programmatic focus, is really a metaphor for the rebalancing of some of these larger questions in society. So to me, our success can serve as a balm, a salve to the larger discussion going on in society, and we should really think of it in that way, not in kind of a localized, kind of within these boundaries of this field, here's the history, but what does this story mean to the nation? Right. And how can that be relevant to people today who have been excluded, and help attract people to these places to find answers? And that's what I think success looks like.
And I like the notion of the open conversation of it giving a place for people to begin with and then move out from. I think we're always trying to figure out how to do that part of it. So we do have a question. So let me read it. How have or will the museum descendant communities engage in the upcoming Virginia Social Science SOL revisions or the recently adopted technical edits as recommended by the AAHEC? So that's very specific to Virginia. So
I can offer one very small response to that, which is that I, representing Montpelier, wrote a letter of support for the we were asked to do it by the organization that Ed Ayers and Annie Evans are running, which is trying to revise curriculum in history. So we wrote a letter of support in favor of the changes that they are trying to push through with the SOLs.
Right. And I think that is even an important mark because these things are going to go into effect in a couple of years, and at least from our point of view, we have been teaching here teachers local history to try and get them prepared to be able to engage in conversations. And to your point, James, the change in the demographics is really something that also is kind of causing the shift in how we're thinking and really trying to understand what do these sites with these people as a collective actually mean for the nation. And I think that feels really exciting to me. And in the past, I've been involved with UVA's President's Commission on Slavery at the university. I now co-chair the President's Commission in the Age of Segregation. And so these conversations are conversations that we are living with consistently because it is this notion of the untold story. It is this idea of recovering the sort of familial oral knowledge as well. And I think that's the other piece of it. For a community of African-American people to have the ability to start talking about their own family histories and connecting young people to those family histories, it feels really important to me to see it from that perspective as well. I know that at the Heritage Center, we talk about trying to create our new griots, because you don't see a lot of African-American people involved in the telling of these stories from these academic spaces and at times. So I have a last question before we end. What do you consider to be the biggest challenge in this process?
Why don't you go first, Elizabeth, and I'll go.
I would say the biggest challenges are disconnects, which I know exist everywhere, between people on the staff level and people on the board level. And this work that we are discussing, this work is the future of historic sites. Mm-hmm. It is the future. And we are not at a place where board members widely recognize that.
Okay, James, how about you?
Well, as a board member, I would say that I have to say that Elizabeth, unfortunately, is right about that. But this is the whole point. The point of entering into a framework of restorative justice, the rubric, the clientage model, there are several different ways to look at it, is a process that will involve winning hearts and minds and moving forward in a way that has not been the traditional model. So it has not been easy. It has been kind of, there's been friction, but it's really, these are early days. And and I do want to say, yes, they're early days, but we have no time to waste. And we have to move fast. So that's really important to say. And I also think it's really important to look at this as not just confined to the plantation space or even the museum space. We're talking about a model of restorative justice, and restorative justice has applications throughout society. It has applications in the private sector. I was reading the other day about a community in Mexico called the Purépecha community in Mexico that woke up and found one day that there was a French designer who was appropriating their work and making millions of dollars off their work. And they were called out on it. And this was written up in the BBC just a few days ago. And it caused this very successful designer, Isabelle Marron, to have to issue an apology. Well, that's a restorative justice issue that is very similar to a descendant issue. I'm hoping that that community then enters into a restorative justice conversation, very much like in the clientage model, where there is using a similar process for the private sector of the rubric to try to equalize power relationships. So what we're doing, I think, is really interesting, not only for museums and historians and archaeologists, et cetera. It's really, it bumps up against something that America has struggled with. We're a very individualistic society, and notions of restoration and justice and communal obligations are very difficult to talk about. And we're hoping that we can help, create a space for these conversations to be had and for benefits to be identified by all parties.
Well, that's the perfect place, I think, to end this conversation. I think that the explanations of the process, I think that those of us who are participating and listening have learned quite a bit tonight. So I thank both of you greatly for taking your time to talk with us about it. I look forward to, in the future, to hearing more. I look forward to whatever participation I may have in that, because for the Heritage Center, this is a very important conversation for us, and how we think about our own future and the impact that we can make on our communities. And this piece of it is undeniably necessary for us to engage in as well. And any way that we can support, that we are here and willing to do that. So thank you both again. I look forward to talking to you at another time. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is great. Thank you so much.